Hi there. So for this week, I decided to pick word recognition from chapter 4 and practice from chapter 5. I think these worked together pretty well because I have been learning a new language. So if you take my English, I'm probably just as proficient as any average person you're going to find. I obviously recognize the patterns that make up English words, and I know English from other languages if I were looking at it or hearing it or speaking it, obviously. But I have been learning German for the past couple semesters, and in reading these chapters, that's what often came to mind as I talked about like priming and recognizing those words and being able to pick up on the patterns, because there are way different patterns in German. And it talked about, the more familiar you are with it, the more you'll understand. So as far as word recognition, so when you start learning a new language, depending on whether it's Latin-based, Germanic, all the different sources, I guess, of where a language comes from, there's certain patterns that persist. When I took a semester of French, it seemed a lot like the Spanish that I'd taken in high school, because those word patterns were similar, of course still pretty different, but even just the words themselves were often similar because they have a very similar base, and lots of the words were spelled very similar and meant the same thing. So while I was learning German, English is supposedly a Germanic language, even though it's kind of just a mess. But it does pull off of a lot of the same words. There are a lot of things you'll just be able to look at and kind of guess what the meaning of that is, which is great. And of course that comes down to recognizing word patterns. So I thought that was pretty interesting. So we talked about priming a lot in these chapters, repetition priming, which of course has a lot to do with learning an entirely new language, because you have to practice it a lot, and the more you practice it, the more comfortable you'll get with it, the more you'll be able to recognize that. It's kind of cool now. I can read like packaging on international products and be able to pick out German and related languages. A lot of those languages up there by like Denmark and Norway and Sweden, they have similar letters, similar patterns. My husband's from Germany, and he said that he can look at some of these different languages and read them. Not necessarily speak them because the pronunciation is very different, but he can read a lot of what they have, and he can tell me that, this language has a lot more O's, but it's if you take those out, then it's very similar, which I thought was awesome. But as far as the repetition priming goes, they say that if you miss language classes, you're not going to get it because you're not practicing it often enough. And that's what I'm worried about this summer, is that my repetition priming is not happening, where I'm not actually taking a class. And so I feel like I'm going to lose a lot of that just from not practicing. So I guess we'll see how proficient I am at it when that starts back up in fall. It talked about well-formedness. So it talked about if you have a letter string of kind of just random letters, you'll recognize a lot less of it than if you have letter strings that are recognizable in that language. That's also what I'm recognizing in German, is they have different common letters and patterns, letter patterns, and you can start to recognize that and associate sounds with that, and then you're able to pronounce it better. That also helps a lot with spelling. When I first started, I had no clue how to spell any of it, but as I'm moving along through German, it's easier to just hear a word and spell it based on pronunciation and how I know those sounds would look written out. It's also very interesting because English and German have one huge difference that I don't think I'll ever get over, and it's IE versus EI, because in English, IE would be I, but in German, IE is E. So you have to switch your thinking, and I'm finding that at least 50% of the time, if I'm just speaking German with my husband, I get it wrong. Maybe not 50% of the time, but more often than I'd like, just because that pattern is so stuck in my head that hopefully I'll get over it one day, but going between the two languages, it's pretty hard. But my husband gets it, and he speaks German and English, so maybe one day I will get it. So that was most of what I got from word recognition. So as far as practicing, I'll also refer to my German for that. It talked about how you can practice to diminish the amount of resource you need for that specific task. And that is very true for learning a new language, because as you practice it and you become more familiar with it, you'll be able to read a lot more efficiently, and you'll be able to speak a lot more efficiently as you go along, of course. That's what you'd expect, because you'll become familiar with common patterns, and the more familiar you get with those common patterns, you don't even think about it anymore. Like certain verb patterns, you'll just have in your memory. It'll be practiced and polished, and you don't have to devote any time to thinking up at least that part of the sentence. Usually I'm pretty good with the first part of my German sentences, so long as I know the verb. It's just the middle part that is usually different and kind of weird. And of course that comes down to just your vocabulary as well, which you just have to learn. But as I've gone through and started to read more German, because that's of course helpful to learning, I found that my ability to just automatically read German gets messed up by just little words that I've seen a million times before, but I guess I haven't put any effort into learning the definition of, and that stops me a lot. So that takes more resources than it should, and I definitely need to work on that. So it talked a lot about, there was the Stroop interface that we talked about, where it was like the word red is in yellow text, and your brain automatically goes to try and think of, what color it is versus what it's supposed to be meaning. We all did that hopefully by now. So sometimes that happens when learning a new language, because you'll see words that in English would mean one thing, but in German, a very similarly spelled word means something completely different, and I find myself falling back on the English instead of the German. It's really nice when the two words that are spelled similarly and sound similarly mean the same thing, but that's not always how it happens, which is kind of annoying, but that's just one thing I have to get over. And so that also messes with my ability to read and understand it, because that word and the way it sounds, even if it's spelled different, but if it sounds the same as an English word, I find myself only able to comprehend the English, which I think that's another hard part of learning a language. So it's nice when things just line up. And it's nice that it's a progressive kind of thing, that the more you practice, the less you have to think about a lot of it. And eventually, hopefully, it just comes down to learning more vocabulary, because you have the word patterns and the sentence patterns down. So hopefully that's where we're going to end up one day. We'll see. I want to see if there's anything else I was going to talk about. Nope, I think that's it. So yeah, that is what I thought of Chapter 4 and Chapter 5. I didn't think Chapter 4 was that boring, but Chapter 5 was definitely more interesting. Anyways, good luck on quizzes and stuff.